because we're doing 2 chapters in one today. It's kind of a, kind of a buy one, get one situation. And I'm excited about it, excited about what I think God has for us this morning as we think about these 2 chapters. I am not going to read all 2 chapters right now, okay? So I'm going to read a section from 25 and then a section from 26, and then we'll walk through the whole thing together in our message. If you don't have a Bible, the words will be available for you on the screen. Let's all stand together, if you're able, for the reading of God's Word. I'm going to read chapter 25, verses 13 to 22, and then we're going to jump over to 26, starting in verse 19. Okay, so those are our texts, and again, it'll be on the screen for us. So, Acts 25, starting in verse 13. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I had supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him." And then continuing on in chapter 26 in verse 19. This is Paul speaking. "Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day I have had the help that comes from God, so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. That the Christ must suffer, and that, by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles." And as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, "Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind." But Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe." And Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul said, "Whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." Then the king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." And Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." This is the word of the Lord. All right, you can be seated. All right, so the sermon this morning, it's going to be a little bit different than the way I normally do it. Part of that's because we're doing 2 chapters, right? So let's get a little different this morning. But I think you'll see it here in a minute. I'm going to talk about kind of an idea that's been out there for a while in kind of one way to kind of think about evangelism, one way to think about sharing our faith. That I think is very much appropriate for the day and the time that we live in here in 2023 America. And I think we see Paul doing that exact thing in these 2 chapters. But just to kind of set the table for us, When it comes to unbelievers, when it comes to non-Christians, people who do not profess faith in Christ, when we think about engaging with them, or we think about conversations or interactions with them, for a long time, it was kind of said and told. I remember growing up in church, this was told to me a lot, that the question people are asking is this: is it true? Is Christianity true? Is Jesus true, right? Did Jesus really come down from heaven? Was there really a virgin birth? Did he really rise from the dead? Are there really miracles? Like all of those kinds of questions. And it had to deal with, hey, fundamentally, is Christianity true? And that's an important question, right? It's a really important question. It's a question all of us have to come face to face with and answer for ourselves. But more and more, there's been a shift in society, and you guys are probably aware of this. But researchers have noticed this shift, and they see it in survey after survey after survey, where the question or the questions that most non-Christians are asking about Christianity is not, is it true? There's actually a couple of questions prior to that. And the most basic one that people are asking today is it good? Is it good? And you guys have probably noticed that more and more people in our society are making the case that Christianity is not good. That is not good for society. It's not good for people to adhere to a Christian moral ethic. That is bad and hurtful. And now you're starting to even see people asking this question: is it safe? Is it even safe to be a Christian? Is it safe to have churches? Is it safe to have church leaders? Okay? And look, that shift didn't happen overnight, right? It's taken a long time to get there. But more and more, I think those are the questions that non-Christians are asking. They're wondering, is Christianity good? Is it safe? Is it even a positive thing? And I think one of the ways that we as Christians, we as the church, that are going to have to adapt, right, is that if we continue to approach non-Christians and come to them fundamentally thinking what they want to know is this true? Okay? I think we're going to have to change our mindset a little bit, because if you're not even sure if something is good or safe, it doesn't really matter if it's true, right? It doesn't really matter, because it's like, well, even if it is true, like, I don't want it to be true. I want something else to be true. And so then we're living in this time where we're faced with this question of, is Christianity a good thing? Is it a safe thing? Is it a beautiful thing? When we went through our values series on being biblically led, we talked about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and that we think the Bible and Christianity tells us that yes, Christianity is true, it is good, it is beautiful, but we live in a time where more and more people are not only wondering if that's true, they're starting to believe that in fact it's not the case, that it's good or beautiful, okay? And so then, I think it's time for us to take an approach that kind of factors that in. A few years ago, I came upon a very famous French theologian named Blaise Pascal. Okay, some of you might be familiar with Pascal. Pascal, 17th century Frenchman. He was a brilliant mathematician and scientist. He actually invented all kinds of things, some of the things like we still even use his basic inventions to this day. And somewhere in the midpoint of his life, he kind of had a radical conversion to Christianity. And once that happened, it really changed the trajectory of his life, and he really started to move away from math and science, and he started to move into the arena of theology and philosophy, and he wrote proficiently. He actually died at 39, which I'm 39. And when I think, every time I read about Pascal and I read about all that he did, I'm like, what have I done with my life? Like, I've just wasted my life compared to what he did. But the reason I'm bringing him up is that Pascal was alive during the era that we call the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, when the Western society really did change. And it was the beginning of a move away from kind of a supernatural understanding of the world to what we would now call a natural understanding of the world, where we look to science and reason to provide kind of the basic answers to the biggest questions in life. That started back then, and now we're living in the fruit of that, right? We eat, sleep, and drink it all the time. And so Pascal's writing in this moment, and I think one of his most significant insights came in how he began to argue that Christianity ought to be presented to people who had rejected God and rejected kind of this supernatural view of the world. And so here's his quote that I'm going to read for us. He says this: "Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is." Now, what Pascal is saying is that there are essentially three stages that a person who has kind of just out of hand rejected a Christian understanding of the world, there's kind of three stages that they need to walk through. And what I think we see here in Acts 25 and 26 is Paul actually walking through each of these stages. I'm going to make the case to you. You can decide for yourself if that's actually what we see. And so as we go through this text and we read through Acts 25 and 26, we're going to do it through kind of these three categories that Pascal gives us for one way to kind of share the gospel that I think is particularly effective in kind of the day and age that we live in. So, three parts. First, we must disarm and surprise. Second, we must make it attractive. And third, we must show that it's true. Okay? So, disarm and surprise, make it attractive, show that it's true. So let's take those one at a time. First, we must disarm and surprise. So let me give a little more of the background on where we are here in Acts 25. Paul is once again on trial. If you haven't been with us or you're not familiar with this section of Acts, Paul's been under arrest now for a few chapters, okay? Remember, he had a trial with the previous governor named Festus. As I kind of mentioned before, Festus was kind of a mess. He wasn't very good at his job. We kind of walked through that case. Festus knew Paul was innocent. He knew the Jews couldn't make the case. They couldn't prove the accusations they were bringing against him. But remember, Festus wanted a bribe. He was like, hey, just give me some money and I'll let you go. And Paul was not going to do that. And he also wanted the Jews to be happy. And so he knew if he released Paul, that would make the Jews really upset. And so he just kept him in jail for 2 years. And remember, he would bring Paul out and talk with him, but he did that because he was hoping to get a bribe. So that was Festus. He was kind of a mess. And so we're told at the beginning of 25 that was Felix. Sorry, we got two F's here, Felix Festus. So he's gone away, and we have a new governor named Festus. So look with me at verse 1. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So it's important to know that Festus is essentially brought in to clean up Felix's mess, all right? Felix was a disaster. Everyone kind of knew that. He gets fired. And it's like, all right, Festus, you need to go in and figure some things out. And this area, I mean, he's there on behalf of Caesar, but this area was the area of Israel. And so he goes down to Jerusalem because that's the main area, and he's trying to figure out, hey, what's going on? Verse 2, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon in Jerusalem because they were planning to ambush to kill him on the way. So a couple of things are very clear. Number one, even though it's been 2 years, the Jews still don't like Paul. They're still really upset. This is the first thing. When Festus shows up, he's like, hey, what do you guys want me to do? First thing, well, there's a guy in prison, and we want that trial to get picked up. The next thing they say is that why don't you bring him back here to Jerusalem? Remember, Festus is already there. It's like, bring him down to Jerusalem so that they can ambush. Now, they wanted to do this before when he got moved out of Jerusalem to plan this ambush. And they're like, hey, we already had the plan. We can do it again. So they still want to kill Paul. So on the Jew side, nothing has changed. They still don't like Paul. They still want to kill him. They still want him to be eliminated. Festus, though, was a man of the law. And he's like, well, it wouldn't be appropriate to have that trial here. We need to have it in Caesarea, where Paul already is. And so he says, I'll go back there. If you guys want to bring the case, you come up there, we'll have the trial. So that's exactly what they do. And so I'm going to skip down to verse 7. When he had arrived, meaning Festus, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Okay, so Luke just kind of gives a clear, definitive statement. They can't prove it. They cannot prove the charges that they're bringing against him. And so then we see that Paul's character is validated. I talked about kind of the importance of seeing our character and our witness. We see that with Paul. And what's interesting is that as Paul gives his defense, and he shows it opens up a door for the gospel, okay? And this door comes open in the passage that I read, that section, verses 13 to 22 of chapter 25. So we're told that after a few days pass, Paul's still in jail, okay? That King Agrippa comes. This is Herod Agrippa II. We've seen several, we've talked before, there's several King Herods throughout the New Testament. This is the great-grandson of like King Herod when Jesus was there, okay? When Jesus was born, that King Herod. This is his great-grandson. And Herod still had a level of authority and power in the area. And so he shows up because, Festus is the new governor, so he's making introductions. And once he gets there, Festus says, hey, you're Jewish. I'd like your take on this really weird case that I have. And so he lays it out. And he says, I inherited this prisoner. He's been here for 2 years. The Jews were so angry. They were so upset. So I heard the case immediately. And I'm thinking, they're going to charge him with being a murderer and all kinds of terrible things. And he's like, no, it's none of that. He's like, they didn't bring any charges that I thought they would. But instead, the way he says it, you look down, chapter 25, verse 19, rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether you wanted to go to Jerusalem. And Paul says no, and he says, I actually appeal to Caesar. And when a Roman citizen appeals to Caesar, that means that they go all the way to Rome, and Caesar hears his case directly. And once someone made that appeal, it had to be granted. Festus knew that's what he was going to do, that he wasn't actually going to give a judgment in the case, that he was going to send Paul on. But if you keep reading, you'll find out, he's like, I don't even know what to tell Caesar. Like, I don't even know what to write down and send with Paul to say, these are the charges that are brought against him. This is why I'm sending him to you. He's like, I'm at a loss. And Agrippa is interested. He says, hey, I want to hear the case. I want to hear this man. He says, great, tomorrow. You stay. We'll do it tomorrow. And so then, what we see in all that is we have two prominent government officials who are now going to get to hear an extended defense from Paul in which he's going to go in and clearly explain the gospel. He's going to clearly talk about Jesus. And it all kind of comes about because of Paul's character, right? And his willingness to be a faithful witness to what God's called him to do. All right, so back to Pascal's insight. So the first thing that Pascal said was that people are not neutral when it comes to the claims of Christianity. And it's important to understand that most people, they don't want Christianity to be true, okay? And I think that's right. And I think the reasons why people don't want it to be true are because of the implications of their life, right? The implications of what is going to happen to my life if it's true. If there really is a God and he really is the creator of everything, and he really has like this moral code, and I'm required to live like that, that is not necessarily good news to a lot of people. Pascal realizes this, and so he says this makes people eager and willing to accept any and all objections to the faith that may come. People are eager to find objections, eager to find reasons, eager to look for what they perceive to be inconsistencies or hypocrites, right? Easy, looking for ways to kind of reaffirm and validate the views and the positions that they hold. And so then, Pascal says that we begin by showing that faith is not contrary to reason. And what he means is that we need to show people that their false assumptions about Christianity are not true. That their false assumptions about the faith, their false assumptions about Christians are not true. This is where what I'm calling disarm and surprise comes in. Tim Keller wrote about Pascal's argument, and he says this about this first feature. He says, many people hope Christianity does not make sense on any level. They especially enjoy hearing about professing Christians who are intemperate, irrational, and hypocritical. This confirms their non-belief. When, however, some presentation of Christian faith, or simply a Christian's character, comes across as well-informed, thoughtful, sensible, open-minded, helpful, and generous, then this breaks stereotypes and commands a begrudging respect. So here, Keller is saying that we must first give people a reason to hear us. And again, I think this is crucial for us today because we live in what I call a post-Christian world, meaning there was a time where America was very much a Christian nation and the majority of people would have believed that, but now they don't. And because of that, I think most people, most non-Christians who are in the world, assume two things. First of all, they assume they know what Christianity is, basically, right? Not that they can get every single detail down. But if you ask someone, hey, what do Christians believe? Or what does it mean to be a Christian? Someone is going to answer, and the answer they give is going to be pretty confident, okay? I think it's going to be very wrong, but it's going to be very confident, very self-assured in their willingness to give a wrong answer. So one, people know what Christianity basically is. And then increasingly, the second thing, that it isn't good. The Christianity is not good. It's like, yeah, I know what that is, and it's not good. It's a bunch of hypocrites. It's a bunch of morality that I'm not interested in. And again, increasingly, as our culture values change, right? Christian values are seen as unloving, as hateful, as dangerous, and these kinds of things. And so then, there's this barrier, right? There's this wall that's been erected. Okay, and in order to break through that, what Pascal is saying and what Keller is saying, and I agree that we're going to need to be able to surprise and disarm people, right? To help people see that some of these false assumptions and ideas that have built up are not really true. And again, I think one of the best ways to do that is through character. Right? It's through integrity. It's just through living out our faith. It's loving our neighbors as ourselves. It's living with integrity. It's living the way that Paul did. And hearing, as they heard Paul speak, one of the things that's interesting, as we've heard Paul give his defense several times now, is that no one's believing, right, the gospel. No one's coming to faith during this time, but people keep wanting to hear. They're like, you know what? I want to hear that again. I'm interested to hear that again. I want to hear this guy. And so there's this interesting thing where no one's believing exactly, but no one's being turned away. None of these Roman governors and authorities who are hearing it, they're not being turned away. They're like, they want to keep conversing. They want to keep having this dialogue with Paul. And I think that's because he's surprising them, right? He's moving past some of the stereotypes that they have in their own minds. So we want to follow Paul's lead. We want to surprise and disarm people and help kind of move past maybe some of those faulty assumptions they have. So that's kind of this first phase. The second phase, Pascal says, is make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true. Make it attractive. Now look, I think a lot of us probably struggle with that word attractive. I struggle with that word attractive, right? That's a lot of time in the church world, we talk about churches being attractional, and that usually means things that I wouldn't be comfortable with, that a lot of us wouldn't be comfortable with. And so it's important to ask the question, well, what is Pascal saying? When he says make it attractive, what does he mean by that? And I think there are a couple of things for us to understand. One is that he's not saying that Christianity is unattractive. He doesn't mean we're putting lipstick on a pig. He doesn't mean Christianity is this really grotesque, ugly thing and we have to somehow fool people or manipulate them into thinking it's something that it's not. he understood what we understand, that there's an inherent attractiveness to Christianity because God himself is attractive. He's God. He, in fact, is the most wonderful and desirable being in all of existence. And furthermore, it's not just God that's attractive, but his message is attractive. The gospel is attractive because it tells us how we can be saved from certain doom and judgment. There's a reason why the gospel means good news, because it is good news. It really is good news. And so Pascal's not saying Christianity is not attractive. Instead, he's saying that we need to point out and expose those things that make Christianity attractive in the first place. Okay? So it's not making up something new or hiding something or deceiving anybody, but instead it's just saying, hey, let's take what is attractive and let's lead with that. Let's put that on display for people to see. But Pascal understood that was going to take some work, okay? Which is why it's a point in the first place, which comes to that line, make good men wish it were true. Keller, again, writing about this, and he says, and I agree, that in order to do this, it's going to take some basic understanding of our culture and just asking a basic question. What is it that our culture finds attractive? Okay? And then show how Christianity provides some answers to that. Let's start with Paul and see what he does, and then I think it'll make a little more sense to us. So in chapter 26, Agrippa shows up, and so now we've got Festus there, we've got Agrippa, we've got a few other kind of magistrates and important government officials, and they're all there for Paul to come out and give his defense again. And so Paul does that essentially by walking through his testimony, which we've seen him share his testimony before. That's why we're not covering it in great detail this morning. But as you read through this, it's important to understand that Paul is speaking directly to King Agrippa. Okay, he is speaking directly to him as a Jew, because Paul is talking like he's talking to Jews. Because normally, when he's in the presence of Romans and Gentiles, right, he talks to them like they're Gentiles. But here, he's making a clear kind of Jewish case, and he's doing that because he's talking to Agrippa. And in fact, as you keep reading there at the end of 26, he's gonna address him explicitly and start asking him questions. But there are some things that come out, okay, that Agrippa is not only a Jew, but he believes the Old Testament. He thinks the scriptures are true. And therefore, as Paul is walking through his story and he's kind of giving his defense again, he is addressing the hopes and concerns that Agrippa has as a Jew who was hoping that God was going to fulfill his Old Testament promises. How do we see that? Well, let me just show you a few ways. Chapter 26, verse 6. Paul says, "And now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promises made by God to our fathers." And you see that, I mean, he's going right. He's saying, hey, I believe the same thing that you believe about the Old Testament. That I'm here because of the promises God made to our fathers. And our fathers meaning Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and on down the line of the fathers of Judaism and the fathers of the Old Testament. And so Paul says, hey, I'm here because of the promises that God made, that one day he was going to send his Messiah. Okay? That is what I'm talking about. And so he speaks directly to that hope that Agrippa would have had. Paul goes on to address another hope, specifically that the dead will be raised. I talked before last week about how Paul continues to press in on this idea of resurrection, not only of the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection, but also the resurrection of the dead. Verse 8, he says, "Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead?" And again, when Paul's talking about that God raises the dead, he doesn't only mean that Jesus was raised from the dead, but he's talking about the future day, the future resurrection of the dead. Okay, and he says, why is it thought incredible by you? One of the questions that everyone must face is what happens when we die. And I would just assert this. Our culture does not have a good answer to that question. Our culture does not have any kind of an answer, I would say, that makes any sense, or certainly that is hopeful, okay? If you think about, I guess, kind of the dominant alternative to Christianity would be nothing. Nothing happens when you die. That this life is all that there is. And I would just say this, right? I mean, I think as Christians, I think we can push back on that and say, okay, if this life is all there is, then that has a lot of implications for how you live today, right? It has a lot of implications for how you live today. And it doesn't provide any hope. It doesn't really provide any sense of security, any sense that any of the wrongs that you experience in this life will ever be righted. I mean, it's really kind of a depressing reality. Or if you think about another idea that's put forth by several religions in the world that is increasingly gaining traction here is the idea of reincarnation, right? And I got to tell you, folks, and I'm not trying to be rude, but I think reincarnation is depressing to me. The idea that we're going to live this life over and over and over again as if this life is super great, right? Like that is a bummer. And to know that you might not do it as a human again the next time. You might do it as something else. Like that's not a great answer to what happens when we die. It's not. That, again, where's the hope? Where is the idea that wrongs are going to be righted, that there's going to be justice? I mean, all of the things that our souls long for, that when we read fairy tales and we watch Disney movies, we really wish they were true. It's like, man, it'd be great if we lived in a world where that was actually true. And then it's like, well, not if reincarnation is the case. Not if nothing is the case. Paul knows how crucial this is. Like this is something, again, every human addresses, every human wonders, like, is this life all there is? And there's a reason he's pressing in on it. He's saying, I know everyone here is thinking about that question, all right? Whether you admit it or not, I know you are. And he's pressing in, and he says, why is it so amazing to think that God raises the dead? Why is that such a crazy thought to you? So he's bringing that issue around. As Paul goes through his story and he begins to talk about how God has called him to be an apostle to the Gentiles, he's showing again that Christianity is for all people, right? It's not just for Jews. The story begins with the Jews, but it does not end there. Christianity is a faith for all people, every tribe, tongue, language, and culture. And again, Paul's speaking to those hopes, right? All of us wonder, like, is this for me? Is Christianity a place where I can fit in, right? Where like my people can belong? And Paul says, hey, the answer's yes. And then I think the other thing, the other hope that people have that Paul speaks to is that real change is possible in this life, right? That it's not just eternity where we're going to see change, but in this life. And so as Paul walks through his story of starting off as a Pharisee who is on his way to Damascus literally to arrest and throw Christians into prison, that he's moved from there to now being someone who's under arrest for Christianity and is willing to die for his faith. It's been a complete 180 for him. And he's saying, hey, there is no more dramatic change that could have taken place than the one that's taken place in my life. And Paul shows that there's hope for real change in this life. He's gone from killing Christians to being willing to die himself to defend Christianity. And so as we walk through all of that, I think we see Paul making the case of Christianity being attractive, okay? Of showing, and again, not attractive in a worldly sense of the word, but understanding that Christianity provides real, substantive answers to our most foundational questions about life, right? That as we, as Agrippa is wondering, and he's thinking, how does this relate at all to the Old Testament scriptures? Does this relate at all to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, the things that I am hoping in? Paul says, yes, absolutely it does. Right? As people are wondering, what about the next life? Is this life all there is? Paul addresses that question. As some people might have, as the Romans were probably wondering, cool that we're talking about Jewish stuff, great. Is there anything for me? Paul says, yes. This isn't just a one-on-one with me and Agrippa, that now God has brought the Gentiles in and that you can be on equal footing, right? That Christianity is for all people. And he offers hope that real change in this life is possible. And I just think, and I was talking to myself as I was thinking about this, I think sometimes we just need to be reminded that we really do have the answers to the questions our world is asking. We really do have a message of hope that no one else has. Our world, you just think about some of the questions that people are wondering, right now. A lot of people are wondering, is there ever going to be a day where Russians and Ukrainians are going to be able to be together and have any kind of peace? How about Israelis and Palestinians? How about Republicans and Democrats, right? Because most people think, nope, no way. There's no way. No way. Those divides are too great. And the amazing thing is we have the answer. Because we can answer in the affirmative to all those. We can say, yes, there is a way forward. There's a way forward for Ukrainians and Russians to be reconciled. There's a way for Palestinians and Israelis to be reconciled. There's a way for Republicans and Democrats to be reconciled. I know that one seems like the most crazy, but it's true. There is a way forward, but it's only by the grace of God, right? It's only through the humility that comes of seeing yourself and your sin at the foot of the cross. That's the way forward. And we have the answer, right? We have solutions. And I think what Pascal realized, and I think what we need to see, is that we don't need to be ashamed about that. We don't need to hide it. But we do need to help people see that, right? We need to help people see, as we see these walls that have been erected, to say, hey, we have real solutions, real answers that can bring down any wall that's not just man-made, but that's made by our real enemy, our spiritual enemy. And Jesus can break those, right? The gospel can break down those walls of oppression that separate us as humans. The gospel can bring those down. But just like the Apostle Paul, we have to know what the questions people are asking are, right? We have to be aware of what they're thinking about and be able to speak with truth to that. So that is what it means to make it attractive. So we start by disarming and surprising. Second, we show that Christianity is attractive. And then finally, we show that it's true. And Pascal basically says, once someone has gone through those first two steps, then we can talk about the truth of Christianity, the truth claims of Christianity. Here's what Keller says about this last idea. He says, if they have not been through stages 1 and 2, their eyes will simply glaze over if you begin talking about evidence for the resurrection. They will still expect Christianity to be at best useless and at worst a threat. But if Christianity has begun to make emotional and cultural sense, they may listen to a sustained discussion of why it makes logical and rational sense. And I said before, if you're not familiar with Tim Keller, Tim planted a church in Manhattan back in the early 90s that grew incredibly. But one of the reasons I really value and respect what Tim says about these things is he lived it for 30 years, right? He lived in one of the most secular places in America and had these conversations with people Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and was able to give robust answers grounded in the faith to questions that people in our society are asking. And so then, once you've laid that groundwork, once we have helped people see that some of their basic assumptions are not true, and then we've begun to show how Christianity answers in a satisfying way some of those basic questions we're all asking, then we move into this, show that it's true. And what we see Paul doing over and over again is always bringing it back to Jesus, right? That's always Paul's plan. His final strategy is, let's get to Jesus. Let's talk about Jesus. In fact, you probably even noticed that as we were reading about Festus describing everything to Agrippa, and he says, they couldn't prove any of the charges, which were crazy, but everything seemed to be about this guy Jesus, right? Who, again, Festus has never heard of. It's everything seemed to be about this guy Jesus. And the fact that he had died, but Paul said he rose from the dead. And so, Festus doesn't even know. He doesn't even know what's going on, but he knows everything's about Jesus. How did he understand that? Well, because Paul made it clear. Everything is really about Jesus. And so he moves right to Jesus. If you look, chapter 26, verse 22. To this day, this is Paul speaking, I've had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. That's Paul's final statement. It's his closing argument, all right? And he ends by he says, look, I am saying what the prophets have always said, that the Christ, who is Jesus, would suffer, he would die, and then he'd rise again, and then his name would be proclaimed throughout the nations, right, to the Gentiles. And so he ends by getting right to Jesus. One more quote from Pascal in thinking about this. He says, knowing God without knowing our own wretchedness makes for pride. Knowing our own wretchedness without God makes for despair. Knowing Jesus strikes the balance between these because he shows us both God and our own wretchedness. Pascal understood Jesus is the key, right? Paul understood Jesus is the key. We must understand that Jesus is the key, that he is the one. As we think about, because I know all of us, as we think about these conversations, it's like, what am I going to say? What if I don't know all the right answers? How do I start the conversation? How do I move forward? There are good questions. There are good answers to all those questions. But let me just say this, in its most basic form, talk about Jesus, right? Get to Jesus. Ask people, what do you think of Jesus, right? How is it that you move, when someone starts talking about good works, right? And they're like, well, I think I'm a good person, and I've tried my best, and all the stuff that people say. It's like, how do I move through that? And it's like, well, talk about Jesus. Who is Jesus? Who do you think he was? What did he do? Who did he say he was, right? And just begin to move people into thinking about Christ. The last thing I just want to end with, just by way of encouragement, is just to remember, like, as we think about people on a journey of coming to faith in Christ, it takes time. It just takes time. For most people, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. And again, just look at some of the responses here. Festus believes that Paul has gone mad, okay? We read this one earlier, but let me just circle back. Verse 24 of chapter 26. As he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. So Festus just calls it out in the middle of his defense. He's like, you're crazy. You're insane. You're learning. You've been reading too many books, Paul. Right? You've been listening to too many people. You need to get out of the library and get back in the real world. And so Festus says that he's gone mad. And then Paul says, no, I haven't gone mad. And then I told you he gets right to Agrippa, verse 27. He says, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? And then he says, I know you believe. What a statement, right? Paul's going for the jugular here. He's going right at him. And he says, I know you believe in the prophets. I know you believe that God's going to send someone. And I'm telling you, he has. It's Jesus. And Agrippa understands what Paul's saying. Verse 28, he says, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Agrippa's like, you have the audacity to like, I've just heard about this. And you're saying you want me to be a Christian? And Paul says, not just you. I wish everyone would believe what I believe, would be as I am, except for these chains. And so we see Paul. Now, again, and I just point that out to say, like, there was not a revival here. There was not an altar call. Nobody put their faith in Christ in this day and time. But there's no doubt people's minds were piqued, right? They were intrigued. There's no doubt that Paul had clarified what the gospel was. There's no doubt that they understood that Jesus was at the center, and whatever was going to happen for the rest of their life, whatever ultimate decision they were going to make, they were going to have to make a decision about who Jesus was, about what he claimed and what he had done. And so God has clearly used Paul to open hearts and minds. And this is what we're all called to do, right? To do our part, to walk on the journey, the path, the road that God has given us. And as we do, like Paul, we point people to Jesus. As we close this morning, I want to wrap up right where Paul did and just bring it back to Christ and understand that he's at the center, and that yes, we have, I think, great answers to the questions that our society is asking, and yet ultimately we have the answer, right? We have the answer, the one who really can answer everyone's questions in ways that we never could, right? And that's Jesus. And ultimately, we are simply called, when we're called to be faithful, we're called to point people to Jesus, right? Through our conduct, through our actions, our character, living with integrity, living the way that Jesus lived on this earth, and then with our words. Right? When people ask us or we engage with other people, we point them to Christ. May that be true of us. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your word and just for the Apostle Paul, for his example that we have. And I thank you for great Christians of the past like Pascal, like Keller, who help us to understand the cultural moment and day that we live in, and help us to have an idea, to be better equipped for how to approach people. God, I pray that as we've considered these texts, we've considered the other things that I've brought to the table. God, I pray just that we as your people here at Sojourn, that we would live lives that are looking to do these things, that by our conduct, by the way we speak, that we speak the truth with gentleness and with respect, that as we do that, it would surprise people. It would disarm people. It would tear down prejudices and assumptions and wrong ideas that people have about Christians and about Christianity. God, I pray that you would help us to have confidence that we have answers, we have solutions. Not that they're ours, they're yours. But you've given us your Spirit, you've given us your word, you've given us incredible knowledge, incredible insight, incredible wisdom. Help us to know how to use that and to leverage that for your sake. And God, I pray that you would help us to be people who point always back to Christ. And that would be just the core of our lives. That we ourselves would go